information to you. Last but not least, we have Knotweed, a tough love, and we all know about that around here, don't we? Our presenter is Steve Schwartz, who is a consultant and partner with Friends of the Upper Delaware River, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Hi all. So Lisa, you're a tough act to follow, but maybe there's a way that we can use knotweed as part of the sustainable solution. And can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
We can.
Can you see the video?
Yes.
So I started focusing on addressing knotweed about 2 years ago when it was a completely wet year. And during the flowering stage of the knotweed, it was everywhere. And this is a drone video taken by Mike Roberto from that year that showed knotweed completely overcoming lots of the river area and completely overcoming a lot of islands. And I started saying to myself, if we know knotweed is everywhere, I'm noticing the few people that are actually doing something about it. So can you see the title screen here now?
Yes.
So I started thinking, how can we, at a landscape scale, start to understand how we can address the problem of knotweed and recruit riparian landowners into setting feasible objectives and trying to manage it. And talk to FUDR and others, and we came up with this project. And the idea behind the project is threefold. One is some basic research into things that have not been looked at before. One is to come up with demonstrations of methods and techniques that landowners can use to manage knotweed that are from the full range of trying to eradicate it to simply trying to control or contain it. Many people do nothing about knotweed because they know it's so difficult to eradicate. But if we could get people to start to manage it, we could start to limit its spread and control it. One of the first things I learned when I started thinking about this problem was that we actually have 3 species of knotweed. We all call it Japanese knotweed, but in the upper Delaware, we have also giant knotweed, which grows really large and has a different leaf structure and some other different morphological characteristics, and Bohemian knotweed, which is a hybrid of Japanese and giant knotweed. And so part of the project was to try to understand what the distribution of these 3 species is and identify where they might be. And so far we found very little giant knotweed, though we found some, but we think that much of the knotweed that we refer to as Japanese is the hybrid. So most of you know that live on the river know a lot about knotweed, but just briefly, it spreads rapidly through seed production, through the rhizomes and runners, and from rhizome fragments. And it used to be thought that knotweed didn't produce seeds, that it was only through rhizomes. But I've seen on my own property after the 2006 flood, there are isolated knotweed plants all over the place in deep forest, and they're never going to spread and colonize unless the forest is cleared, but they're there, and that came through seed banking over the years. It loves disturbed soil and floodplains. Along the floodplain, there's all these ice gouges. When the ice breaks up, there's other types of disturbances. That's where you're going to first start seeing knotweed happen. And if not managed, it will then spread. And what it does, and the problem with knotweed, is that it crowds out all other native riparian vegetation. In a healthy riparian plain, there are hundreds of different types of vegetation that provide soil retention, they provide nectar and pollen to pollinators, they provide habitat for all kinds of creatures. Where there's knotweed, there's nothing. There's nothing else. And so that limits succession. It leads to stream bank destabilization. And our hypothesis is that it leads to erosion and soil loss. So part of the project is to calculate the extent of knotweed in the 100-year floodplain of the upper Delaware. Everyone knows that it's everywhere. And Jim, your images were great, and we should probably talk a little bit more about combining our data. What we have done is scheduled and now taken 5 aerial photography flights along the upper Delaware of different stretches. And what we're trying to amass is a sequence of still images taken in a precise technical way with GPS data that can be mosaicked together and then orthorectified, which means that a point that you see on the land is the same as the GPS might say it is in a digital map, and come up with an auto-translate mechanism to determine what the actual area of the patch is. And eventually we will have a way to say that knotweed has now colonized a percentage of the floodplain. We don't know if that's 10%, 15, 20, whatever it is, but that information isn't known right now. And the reason that we want to do that is to get a baseline of where the knotweed is now, and then give that map, that digital map of the extent of knotweed, to our soil scientists. And what they're going to do is come up and take soil samples and analyze the composition of the soils, their mobility in water, and come up with a model of how much soil and sediment might migrate into the aquatic environment from below the areas that are inhabited by knotweed. My hypothesis is that in a healthy riparian area where there's all these different grasses and shrubs and trees and bushes, soils are more or less maintained. But where knotweed establishes and none of those other grasses or vegetation can hold the soil starts to erode. And in high water events, it moves into the water bodies. Here's a picture where you have the native grasses on the right, the knotweed on the left, and it was a high water year. So the knotweed was killed off in this intermediate zone, and you can see erosion happening. Here's another picture where the knotweed will hold gravel and cobble together. It will hold gravel and cobble banks together, but it won't hold the soils. So the soils are just washed away, and all you're left is gravel. Now, that's the research component. The other components of the project are objective setting. As we know, most of the land in the upper Delaware is owned by private landowners. Most of the knotweed is on their land, and everyone knows that it's important to cut your grass or mow your field or hay, but very few people address knotweed, and because eradication is really hard. If you are able to find some isolated plants early on, you can address them. But and eradicate them, but eradicating large swaths like we have in the Upper Delaware is really difficult. And it's not an issue of governmental action. It's not an issue that can be done on a concerted basis. It's an issue that can be addressed landowner by landowner in the way that they feel most comfortable. So what we're trying to do is come up with methods that allow landowners to see what they could do, what the level of effort is, the cost, what the outcome might be, and try them out and try to do something. So the techniques that we are going to show in our demonstration sites include repeated mechanical cutting. And if you mow a patch of knotweed repeatedly, you'll end up with lawn. But the lawn in a riparian setting doesn't provide all the same services as native riparian vegetation. So there are other forms of mechanical cutting that are selective that allow other vegetation to grow within the knotweed and compete. We're going to show covering with a geotextile membrane, and you know, you've seen some places where people put down blue tarps. We're working with Owens Corning that has a specific product that can be engineered to deal with all kinds of issues, including knotweed, and that will be shown at the demonstration sites. There are two forms of herbicide application that can be used to control knotweed. One is spraying it on leaves, and the other is actually injecting each stem. Some people don't want to use herbicides, but in terms of eradicating large areas, that is the most effective, with an expense and some other issues involved. We're going to bring to the Upper Delaware something that we've seen in more urban areas around the country, which is weed management through foraging. So we're contracting with a goat farmer to bring goats into knotweed patches on a organized basis to repeatedly eat the knotweed and see what the effect of that is going to be. The farmer has trialed it with his goats, and he says the goats love the knotweed when they're first introduced to it. They'll eat it right up, but he thinks they'll get bored after a while. So the idea is that we'll bring them in 1 or 2 days per month over 5 months to keep them interested and to address the patch. And there's some other techniques that we've discussed, including burning. There's a mesh application that has come out of England. Some people have suggested freezing. Some people have suggested using electrical charges. We probably won't do any of those things, but there are other techniques that we can discuss. On the other hand, we just saw an interesting situation recently. The UDA went through a public comment period about releasing a biocontrol that's been tested in lab settings for the last 10 years, which is an insect that they found in Japan that likes to eat knotweed. And during the public comment period, the overwhelming number of comments against releasing this insect as a biocontrol came from the bee lobby. And beekeepers love knotweed because for 2 weeks of the year, the bees are all over it. And knotweed is in the buckwheat family, so the honey tastes like buckwheat honey. And they were opposed to eradicating knotweed because it would affect the bees. But on the other hand, native riparian vegetation provides nectar and pollen for 5 months a year, whereas knotweed really is only attractive for a couple of weeks. But we have to acknowledge the benefits. Red-winged blackbirds love to nest in it. Mammals love it for cover. Some of my foraging friends love to eat the young knotweed shoots, which can be eaten both raw and cooked and have some of the flavor characteristics of rhubarb. Knotweed rhizomes are harvested and dried and processed for herbal supplements. They have a high concentration of resveratrol, which is also in red wine and things like that, which is great for a number of metabolic processes. It's used extensively in Chinese medicine. And going back to Lisa's thing, maybe the fibers of knotweed could be used for sustainable flatware. You know, you see the palm leaf plates that are used for picnics that you can, you know, compost. Maybe knotweed can be used for something like that. So, you know, we're trying to have fun with this. There are, you know, recipes, and here are the 3 demonstration sites. We selected the demonstration sites because we wanted places where there's a lot of knotweed, which is not hard to find, but they're also publicly accessible, and there's parking, and each of these 3 sites is a boat launch. And this year, during the pandemic, we saw them highly used. So at each of the sites, we're going to show techniques and methods of knotweed management. There, for 2 of the sites at Deposit Village Park and Skinner's Falls, there will be permanent installations with 6 plots that show the different treatments with interpretive signage pointing back to web-based information. And we'll also hold events at those sites where the consultants and contractors that are involved in the management come and show how to apply herbicides, or the goats will be there and the farmer will teach people about goats, and we'll be able to answer questions. And we're also recruiting volunteers to help with those sites and also to help with the dissemination of the information. The project was supposed to start at the beginning of this year, but due to the pandemic, we were not able to get the on-the-ground work happening at the demonstration sites, but we have been able to do much of the aerial photography, and the mapping is in progress, and some of the other research, the botanical survey, has happened this year. And so we will roll out the demonstration sites next spring.